Hello, this is Jessica Ebert, and I'm going to be presenting about an ESL history. The overview is the purpose of this presentation is to inform about 10 key policies and cases that contributed to the development of ESL education and programs. First, I have the Brown versus Board of Education case that happened in 1954. So in this case, the ruling passed that segregation in schools was unconstitutional. This case helped establish the separate but equal precedent that defined the preceding years in the education system. With this ruling in place, it was now clear that English language learners, ELLs, could not be separated completely from other students just so that they could supposedly better learn the English language. This ruling opened people's eyes to see that although students were now receiving equal treatment, that would not suffice for ELLs who did not need equal treatment but equal opportunities, which meant that they should be treated in a way that accommodates for their situation. Next, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The purpose of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was to prohibit discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. This act made it clear that all students, regardless of if they can speak English or not, needed not only equal treatment but equal educational opportunities in the long run. The passage of this act began the process of desegregation and strove to decrease discrimination. This led to a better understanding of what it meant to provide equal opportunities for ELL students. Next is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESEA, and this was in 1965. This act is the foundation for policy and law concerning federal education. It is the source of funding for the education systems, and it focuses on students from low-income families. The ESEA is important because before it was introduced, many schools did not provide appropriate education for language minority students. They were either placed in segregated classrooms or were ignored and left to fend for themselves and survive on their own with no additional language instruction. Because of this act, the needs of language minority students were beginning to be met, and so education improved for these students. Next is the Bilingual Education Act of 1968. This act was added as Title VII to the ESEA. It provided federal funding for bilingual programs through the awarding of grants. This act was very important for the development of bilingual education because funding was provided for schools to promote a bilingual education for students. Lawmakers had argued for this act with the reasoning that education in the United States should no longer be English only, but should teach English to language minority students as a second language. When this act came into play, bilingual education was truly able to develop with its new funding. Next are the law remedies, which led to the Equal Educational Opportunities Act in 1974. The law remedies went into effect after the Lau versus Nichols case. In the Lau versus Nichols case, it was officially determined that although language minority students were in fact receiving relatively equal treatment in their schooling as all of the other students, they did not need equal treatment, but treatment that accommodated for their needs as students who do not speak English. They were not receiving an education that they could understand or benefit from. The Lau remedies were created to require schools to effectively put into practice programs for English language learners. The Lau remedies came into federal law as the Equal Educational Opportunities Act in 1974. This act was crucial to the further development of effectively reaching students in the language minority, as it is federal law that must be abided by in each public school system. So next is the Castaneda Standard that happened in 1981. So an outcome of the court case Castaneda versus Pickard in 1981 was a test referred to as the Castaneda Standard. This test was put in place to ascertain whether or not schools are addressing the needs of ELL students with their ESL programs. The three areas to determine this are to determine the Castaneda standard tests are: number one, the programs must be based on a sound educational theory. Number two, they must be implemented effectively with sufficient resources and personnel. And number three, they must be evaluated to determine whether they are effective in helping students overcome language barriers. This test has helped in the development of bilingual education because it has established a set standard for ESL classes to refer to. Although it is not a perfectly implemented test, it is beneficial for the development of bilingual education. Next, we have the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. The No Child Left Behind Act officially renamed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Under this act, bilingual programs were neither enforced nor discouraged. This act required that all students take state-mandated tests starting in the third grade. Students were required to take these tests regardless of their understanding of English, so students in language minorities had to take these tests with little to no additional help. Eventually, there were 2 exceptions that were added for English language learners, but they were minimal. Under this act, all students were expected to meet the state standards set for these tests. The result of this act was that many schools began to teach to the tests instead of teaching for the sake of simply learning, which oftentimes left out students in a language minority. Next is Race to the Top. This was in 2009. So, as federal administration dealt with the No Child Left Behind Act and its consequences, they implemented a few different policies. One of them was called Race to the Top. Race to the Top provided funding for education programs through grants so that they could work on improving their educational programs. And over $4 billion was set aside for these education reforms. And for states to receive this funding, they had to adhere to certain standards for education, including the creation of standards and assessments that were beneficial for all students. This impacted bilingual education because it meant that schools needed to accommodate for English language learners. Although this addressed ELLs, it also put an emphasis on student testing and test scores, which does not always benefit education in the long run. Next, we have ESEA flexibility. This was 2011. So another policy implemented by federal administration in response to the No Child Left Behind Act was Elementary and Secondary Education Act flexibility. This system worked to avoid the No Child Left Behind expectations while still maintaining accountability in schools. Schools were able to apply to create their own systems of accountability for student achievement, similar to the Race to the Top standards in the last slide. Although this flexibility helped in the process of moving away from the No Child Left Behind Act, it did not typically provide much detail to distinguish English language learners from other students, specifically from students who are just grouped and considered the general term of at risk. Next, we have the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015, or the ESSA. This is essentially the No Child Left Behind Act, but with much greater flexibility. So schools are able to come up with their own plans for accountability as long as they are approved plans by the federal government. With this act, it's more likely that the expectations for English language learners will be more adaptable and accessible for the students' needs. This plan is still just starting, and therefore it is not well tested for shortcomings. However, it appears likely that with more flexibility while still having accountability, English as a second language classes will be held to reasonable expectations and be able to accommodate the needs of ELLs in general. And here is the reference that I used for this presentation. Thank you for watching.